Well, we're actually going to get started. We're probably going to have some late arrivals, so I apologize. But essentially, we want to try and keep this on time so that the better part of tonight's happenings will be the group discussion, because we really want to have a conversation, which is why we have that title. This is now our second year that we've been doing the conversation series. I see a lot of familiar faces, so many of you have been to our conversations before. How this typically works, I give a mini presentation. We have some panelists that come up here to warm up everyone, and then we do roundtables where we take part of one big conversation or discussion across the room. So welcome to the Dittrick Medical History Center and Museum. We've been around for a long time. Over here is Chief Curator Jim Edmonson. And we basically have a lot on offer here. It covers a great deal. We've got the Percy Sky Contraception Collection. We have material on birth and reproduction. We have things on antiseptic medicine and surgery. Lots and lots to see at the museum. In addition, we're trying really hard to show the human story behind medicine. So tonight, what I want to do, my name is Brandy Schillace, and what I want to do is take us through a little bit of history that looks at fashion and that also looks at gender. And we have, Jennifer Nieves has curated a temporary exhibit in our gallery on corsetry, and Patty Edmonson from the Western Reserve Historical Society, Cleveland History Center. You're lots of that. She's from lots of places. It's all over there. And she's also brought some items that she's going to show and talk about tonight as well. And there's cookies, and there's swag, and there's juice, and I hope that you guys are going to have a wonderful time with us tonight. So first, let me just thank our sponsors, the Cleveland Medical Library Association, who continue to support the public engagement for the Dittrick Museum. The Case Western Reserve University Social Justice Institute, who work toward equal access and opportunity for all people, addressing root causes of social injustice and developing solutions, and the CWRU LGBT Center, which is dedicated to serving the diverse campus population and ensuring safe and supportive agendas for LGBTQIA. So thank you all for being here, and we are going to get started talking about love hurts. And there's a question mark, because we're getting close to Valentine's Day. And that's why we have heart-shaped cookies out there. My friend always called Valentine's Day Eat Chocolate and Wear Black Day. She's not a fan. But the reason for that question mark is we're going to talk a little bit about what this really entails. Suffering for fashion or fashioning an identity. And there's two different ways of looking at how fashion works. Is it a form of repression? Is it a form of expression? And there's different ideas about this. So we'll start off looking at clothing and health and talking a little bit about what the medical aspect of clothing can be. Underneath, so for instance, how we got from, say, the empire waist to waist training. I'm an 18th century scholar, and in the 18th century, dresses all had the waist way up high, the big empire waist, and then nice drapey cloth everywhere. It's great for Thanksgiving, it's very roomy. But we moved into, in the 19th century particularly, though I don't think it began in the 19th century, it was a little earlier than that, wasn't it? Patty, I'm sorry, looking at you.
What began in
the tight lacing is 19th century, but corsets have been around before that, right?
Yeah.
Jenny?
Yeah.
Long before that,
So,
okay.
Stays,
right. So the empire waist was very popular in the 18th century, and then in the Victorian period, you start seeing the corsets and various different kinds of corsets, and also straight lacing. So one of the things that I came across in my research when I was working on gender and history for the dissertation was that straight-laced propriety is actually related in many ways to this idea of it's proper to wear a laced corset, and they used whalebone stays. So we're going to talk a little bit about that history, and briefly, and then again during the panel discussion with, we have two of our panelists can tell us about the history of that fashion. But I also want to talk about another fashion, something many of us who are female, but also some men as well, and that's high heels. High heels is another form of fashion which many people think is potentially bad for you. Some people have compared it to foot binding, which was practiced in early days. They would actually wrap the feet as the foot grew. Where's the origin of heels come from? What's a stiletto? Why is it called that? So we're going to talk a little bit about that too. But the feature event is to say a bit about identity making. As an 18th century scholar, I ran across an interesting story, the Chevalier d'Eon. This is a soldier who lived the first half of her life as a man and the second half of her life as a female. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that meant and how clothing gets involved in that story in the 18th century. And it also gets involved in a political story that happens between France and England, because there's a tension that's involved there. But let's start with what's underneath. This picture, this is actually the case of Ethel Granger, and she's talked about briefly in our temporary gallery. Ethel Granger is, I think, a really exceptional case. This is not the kind of thing that you saw all the time. So I don't want to make it sound like everyone tight-laced to this degree, but she had a 13-inch waist. And to show you a little bit about how corsetry changes the shape, we have some pictures in the gallery. But essentially, it's tucking things in, it's pulling the rib cage in, and it tends to move the organs about. But Ethel Granger was unique, and it was partly due to her husband's suggestion. She continued to shrink her waist more and more, to the point that it was 13 inches around. He also asked her to wear incredibly high heels, and later he suggested facial piercings. And so he had a bit of a fetish for facial piercings, and so she ended up with bones through her nose and various other things. But she lived to the ripe old age of 87. So on one hand, we say to ourselves, oh, this couldn't possibly be healthy for you, and on the other hand, she herself lived a long time. So we're going to be talking a little bit about what some of those medical effects would be when we get to our panel discussion. High heels, though, this is one that I'm like, yeah, those are terrible, and I wear them all the time. I'm not wearing them today because I broke my toe, but I did actually wear high heels yesterday on my broken toe. So it just shows you that sometimes knowing things doesn't necessarily change what you do. It tends to put the foot out of alignment. It causes your lower back to kind of deform depending on how you walk. It puts pressure on the knee and on the ball of the foot. And the Osteopathic Association is basically, they're really against heels. In fact, I have a DO, and every time I go to see him, he's like, I intentionally wear flats so that he doesn't, get angry with me. But he knows. He knows. So we have a tendency to wear fashion, even fashions that might not be terribly good for us. How many of you have seen young people who don't want to wear coats? Right? You're like, I saw you come in. Right? Because we're like, oh, they're bulky. And I remember going to the mall and like trying to stash the coat in the car before I dashed out. My parents are going, what are you doing? We all tend to do things with fashion because we're interested in the way things look, even if maybe we shouldn't be doing certain kinds of things. But is fashion necessarily repressive? In Ethel Granger's case, it was largely considered to be her husband that kind of forced her to do this, and that might be debatable. She did rebel at least a couple times in her life about wearing the corsets, and that was something he wanted. And many people look at that and say, see, that's repression right there. You're forcing women to dress this way. But by and large, no one's forcing me to wear high heels. So why do I do it? Well, partly I do it because I'm making a statement, a fashion statement, even maybe a dumb one. But I do. So let's talk a little bit about clothing and what it does for us in terms of personality. And then during our panel discussion and during our larger discussion, I hope that we'll have a conversation about how those things work together. At what points is fashion repressive, and at what points is it expressive? So clothing makes the, how do you normally finish that? Man. Right. Well, in this case, not entirely. So later known as Madame de Beaumont, but this is also the Chevalier d'Eon. And started off life as a French diplomat, a spy, a soldier, a Freemason, a dragoon, and a fencer. Was also a crossdresser. So this portrait is really interesting. This is from the National Portrait Gallery of London, and they announced that they acquired this portrait in 2012. And what they loved about it is that the gallery curator points out that if you look closely, and I don't think you can tell from this snippet, but if you actually see the painting in person, they have painted in stubble and whiskers as well. So you have this person wearing women's fashion. It's not a photograph, so if you wanted them not to paint in the whiskers, you would obviously have that as your right. You're paying for the portrait. But they were painted in, and what the curator feels is that it's a display that this person wanted to be perceived as someone who was kind of on the boundaries, who was a woman, considered herself a woman, dressed as a woman, but retained aspects of facial hair and other things as well. Now, Lucy Peltz, the gallery curator, says this is one of the most important transvestites in history. But that term can be a little bit loaded, and there's a lot of disagreement about, is this cross-dressing? Is it trans? Is it, is it something in between? Is it something else entirely? And so it's a really interesting story, and I think what makes it interesting in terms of fashion is just how much clothing became involved in the discussion. So one of the most important figures, partly because people found them to be inspirational. And she was, if you consider that she had two separate inspirational lives. So as a soldier, was decorated with medals for bravery under fire. He took prisoners and rose in the ranks, served as a secret agent. Tried to, and as a secret agent to London. We're always thinking of the Cold War and it's James Bond against Russia, but in fact, this was a French person going undercover in England, trying to get close to the Queen. Helped to negotiate the Peace of Paris in 1763, and even received this, the cross, the St. Louis Cross. Offered to lead a battalion of Amazons after cross-dressing. So this person did not suddenly change all habits. Said, now that I'm a woman, I will train Amazonian women, and we will go to war in Austria. Toured as a female fencer as well in female dress. So there's a lot of really interesting facts about this person. The Chevalier did not stop being dashing and brave and doing crazy things when this person changed from a man to a woman. Instead, it became part of this persona. In her autobiography, she writes an autobiography. This is great because the autobiography is almost completely fictionalized. Yeah, but that's what makes it wonderful. She fashioned an identity that she wrote for herself. So there were facts in it, but it was largely, I think all autobiographical information is kind of curated. This was curated more than others. She claims in her autobiography that she was always female. And she says, no, 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 you have it all wrong. I wasn't a man and then became a woman. I was always a woman, and I was just faking you out, pretending to be man so I could be a soldier. And no one knew. And so there were bets placed, actually. It was a very big deal in London. People would place bets on whether or not this person was really, and everyone wanted to know, were they really male or really female? Were they a man that became a woman that became a man? But I find the word really interesting, really. One of the historians of her life that I had been looking into kept using that word, saying, well, we know she was really a man, but that casts everything in this binary that says there's some sort of real gender going on here. And I find that interesting that even historians who are interested in exploring trans are nonetheless trying to fit things into boxes, and sometimes they don't go in there very well. Some other interesting facts. The reason that this gender change partly gets debated is because it happens due to some very political reasons. It turns out that the Chevalier did not want to move back to France, lived in London, had made some enemies while negotiating the Peace of Paris, and said, I'm not a man, you shouldn't come and get my life, you can't come after me as a soldier, I'm a woman. And in France, they said, okay, well, if you're a woman, you have to wear women's clothing from now on. They didn't ask for a physical exam. It's just like women's clothing. You have to give away all your medals. You have to strip yourself from all of your awards. You no longer did those amazing things in the war. We're taking that out of history now, speaking of fictionalizing history. And you always have to wear women's clothing, and then we will consider you a woman. So there are some who argue that, in fact, oh, this was just done to protect. She was doing it to protect herself from people who wanted to take her life. At the same time, we have purchase records that long before this discussion happened, she bought women's underclothes. So even under male dress, she was wearing women's underwear and other kinds of objects that were traditionally female. So it's a really interesting, if you look up this person, you'll find half the people think that this was political, and other half people say, no, it's completely legitimate. She owned the largest library of books on women's rights and women's nature of anyone at the time. She wrote female polemics, which at the time were usually sort of Christian polemics arguing for the superiority of the female soul. It's very complicated and rhetorical. I did 2 chapters on that in my dissertation, and it's not interesting at all if you're not me. But it is fascinating stuff. And she would have had this enormous library talking about what is woman's nature and the superiority of woman's nature. So that's while she's a man before she becomes a woman. She has this library. It's not something that just cropped up later on. Gary Cade is a historian. He suggested that it was an adopted persona of moral regeneration. Others suggest it was to avoid political enemies. Others said she took it because she wanted to express a new identity that she herself felt was really a part of her. What's interesting to me is the story she wanted people to know was that she was originally female. She really did not want to be thought of as ever having been male, even though this change happened in midlife. This is Philip Mould, the London art dealer that sold the portrait. This is his quote. He says, "Everything then began to click into place. What is so unusual about this portrait is that it is so brazenly demonstrative in a period when you don't normally get that type of alternative persona expressed in portraiture. There is no attempt to soften his physiognomy. Basically, he was a bloke in a dress with a hat." I think that's a little denigrating, but the idea is that it is something that was intentionally done. This portrait was made to be big and bold and say specific things. So where does that put us? The case is not really an answerable case. It's not one where we can go, yes, absolutely, no, absolutely. When the Chevalier died, an autopsy was ordered. And even after the autopsy, the final declaration, there were 2. One said, yes, she's really female, and the other one said, yes, she's really male. So we still don't know. There's still 2 different divergent accounts of who this person was, and I think that would have pleased her, actually. But there are other cases of identity in this time period being changed medically. So here we have, the Chevalier story is interesting because a lot of the identity came down to what were you wearing and how did that fashion who you were. But there were medical changes, and we don't normally think of gender reassignment surgery as being anything that happened in the 18th century. But in fact, there was the strange case of 1787. A Dr. Thomas Brand said that parents brought a child to them, a little girl, that had a swelling in her abdomen. And in fact, he decided it was actually a boy mistaken for a girl, and he made several incisions to free the penis so that she could, quote, wear trousers and enjoy the privileges of being a male. So there was a very clear sense that this was a better option for this person. And so this is it's early. Things happened early on. So at the time, gender wasn't conceived as like a form of identity. It was conceived of as a form of body. So in the 18th century, nobody, it's interesting. You have the Chevalier doing this kind of thing, but at the same time, you have people going, oh, we must return this person to the gender that they should have because then they can enjoy the privileges. Now, for Dion, putting on the clothes of a woman made her a woman. And a jury actually declared her one. Like, this had to go to court. No surgery, no medical examination was required. For cases in the 19th century, though, particularly when women dressed as men, the consequences were really dire. It could be really bad. Medical consultations and even incarcerations in asylums were frequently common. And in a time period, especially before germ theory, incarceration in an asylum was often a death sentence. You were going to die of something, tuberculosis, a fever. But there's a great case of Dick or Mamie Rubel in 1890. And here's a case where you have someone who, in fact, says, I am both genders, and is very serious about this and doesn't want to be perceived as one or the other. I'm neither a man or a woman. And the judge sent her to the asylum for not only for wearing men's clothes, but for she was seeking legal authority to do so. Rubel took herself to court because she wanted to claim that she was neither gender. And when the judge questioned her, she said, locate gender on my body. Show me where it is. And she held up a hand. She was a very tall, big woman. She worked in physical labor. She held up her hand and said, is this the hand of a woman? So you start having communications about the way things look. And this is in the 19th century. There's other cases where sometimes things could backfire. A woman was 14. She was, her parents had died. There was no one to take care of her. She couldn't get a job because women tended not to be employable. So she pretended to be a man and became a laborer living at a guest house. The landlord of the guest house found out that she was a woman and then blackmailed her into marrying her pregnant daughter so that she would have to take care of her pregnant daughter. So the woman now pretending to be a man is taking care of this woman who is pregnant and her mother-in-law. And then the woman got pregnant a second time, and she was like, I can't do this anymore. So she runs away and is arrested for wife abandonment. And only in court is like, I am not a guy. So she finally divests herself. But in a way, she was kind of caught in this bizarre double bind where you can't win for losing, essentially. So we can talk a little bit about fashion statement. Does restraint become power? I love this image, by the way. There was a lot of worry that if women started wearing men's clothes, if women started wearing pantaloons, for instance, that they would start smoking cigars and riding bicycles and telling men what to do, and men would have to do laundry, and it was just a terrible thing. So we've had this kind of idea that somehow clothing is going to do something to us. And on one hand, we might say, oh, that sounds silly, but is it true? Does clothing, in fact, help us fashion an identity? Or is clothing, particularly for corsets and tight lacing, a particularly dangerous thing to do? And so I've set this up basically just to kind of get us thinking about these points. And I have some talking points up here that I want us to think about. But primarily, I want to bring our panelists up here to have a discussion, to kind of talk about these issues, and then open it up to all of you. There's no right answers necessarily. This is more meant to open up dialogue and to have interesting questions about corsets versus tight lacing. What's the difference? How dangerous was tight lacing? Was it dangerous medically? What happened if you were pregnant, for instance? Why did women abandon corsets? What drives the use of corsets today? Because people still wear them. What are the risks of fashion today? And are there specific risks, say, for trans men and trans women? In what ways does fashion become a marker for gender identity? And do you see fashion as power, privilege, repression, all three? So here are just some talking points. I'm now going to bring our panelists up. We're going to go through some of these questions, and then we're going to hear from all of you. So I'd like to invite our panelists up now. We can spread them out a little bit. Is it okay if we move this over a little? Okay. Sorry, we've got camera people up there. Are these on? Are the mics on? Okay. You guys will have to share the mics. On one hand, I realize that we're not actually projecting, but we are being recorded for the film. So whenever you guys start to ask questions, we'll be running the mics around too. All right, so you guys will make sure to share them as you answer questions. So let's start with this first question and just start us off and warm us up. Corsets versus tight lacing. Oh, wait, no, we have to introduce the panelists. What am I thinking? That helps, and you know who you're talking to. I'm actually going to let them introduce themselves because that always seems to go better and smoother. And we'll start over here with Patty Edmonson and work our way around.
Okay. Okay, I'll wear my single glove. Is this on?
It is. It's not projecting. It's talking to the...
Got it. I'm with you.
You're cool.
I was listening before. Okay. My name is Patty Edmonson. I have a long job title, which is the Museum Advisory Council Curator of Costume and Textiles. I work at the Cleveland History Center, which is the University Circle site of the Western Reserve Historical Society. I'm sure you're all going to remember all of that. But if you know where the VA hospital is, we have a big carousel that you can see from the street. We're we're still on the oval with the other museums, but tucked away back there. So, all right.
Okay. My name is Jennifer Nieves. I'm the Archivist and Registrar here at the center. I've had an interest in corsetry for a long time. This exhibit this is the second time it's been up in 27 years, I think. And I early on did a paper while I was in graduate school about corsetry just as a morbid curiosity, and I had no intention on going into any medical history field, but I was certainly glad that I had an interest in that when I got here to the museum, because most of the resources I found are here in our medical journals, so it was a lot of fun, very interesting to do. So please be sure to look at the exhibit when we're mingling around.
Hi, I'm Dr. Erin Tomlinson. I am brought to you by the Pride Clinic at Metro Health Medical Center. I'm a CASE graduate. I graduated from CASE Biomedical Engineering in 2005 and CASE Medical School in 2009. and now I'm an assistant professor of medical education at Case, as well as a clinician in the Pride Clinic. We take care of LGBT patients, including hormone management for transgender patients. Oh, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Hi, my name is Liz Roccaforte. I'm the director of the LGBT Center here at Case, and I don't do anything with medicine or fashion, but I hope to bring a queer perspective. And my pronouns are she, her, hers.
All right, great, thank you. So we're going to start off with this first question about corsets versus tight lacing and what the difference is between those two things.
Well,
Oh, Mike, sorry.
yeah, I'm going to forget this every time.
Okay.
Okay, so Jenny will talk and Patty will show.
Well, as we were saying earlier about the fact that women and men have been wearing stays or items within their undergarments that hold the body in, because of course you don't want to see those unsightly bulges. And that even in the early Middle Ages, they were wearing flowing robes, but underneath the body was being kept in by stays and bones. And we didn't really start calling them corsets until the 19th century. There were things like the farthingale and all these fancy names for basically the same thing that would keep the female body looking a certain way. And then in the 19th century, we started to call them corsets, and they presented the female body in a way that kept it kept everything in place. There was not a lot of movement. And the difference between that and tight lacing is corsetry was a fashion, and it was something that a lot of the society did. Historians are now finding more and more that, yes, wealthy women did wear corsets, but that also trickled down as far as the working women because it was fashion, and they did not want to be left out of fashion. Tight lacing, on the other hand, is something that brings attention to the person. With Ethel Granger, if you saw her walking down the street next to someone walking with her with a corset on, you wouldn't even pay attention to the woman in the corset. You'd be looking at Ethel because she's tight lacing to the point where she's abnormal looking. And in a society where you have a nice hourglass shape, here she is with a wasp shape, and that's where we got that term wasp waist, is that you actually look like a bug, and you have a thorax and an abdomen, and this little tiny thing in between that just barely keeps those two pieces together. I question, how does the spinal cord fit in a 13-inch waist? I mean, that spinal cord's got to take up most of that 13-inch waist. So it's very curious. So, anything to add?
Sure. I'll just add a little bit. So in my thinking for tonight, I was, like Brandy said, people are wearing different kinds of undergarments to shape their body long before the 19th century, but I'm going to start at the 18th century. So the stays are more of like a conical shape and less about having that hourglass shape, more just a support system. Little girls wore stays, but it was more like to correct believed it was to correct posture. So little girls and little boys, sometimes men did. What I brought with me, I brought a corset from the early to mid 19th century. I'm just going to hold it up.
Sure.
Yeah. And then I'll kind of speak in. So this is different in that it doesn't have any boning. It's cording, so it's actually pretty soft. And you can see that it laces up the back. But the support is sort of, the decoration and support kind of are one in the cording around the breasts there. So this is like one of the first garments that's really called a corset. And then I brought one that's a little bit later. This one's 1880s, and they kind of looked like this for a long time. And, oh, I forgot to mention my busk. This is a busk. Sometimes they were made of wood, too, and that would be slit down in the front, so that really gives you that upright structure, so that could slide into that corset. The busk goes away, but you have almost like the busk is cut in half here with the two thicker pieces of metal at the center. So you hook that, and then you can lace or tight lace the back. Just one note, if you look at a lot of museum records and look at the measurement of a corset, it's going to give you that measurement as if the back is totally laced together. But it's likely, I mean, you could use the laces to give yourself several more inches. So those measurements can sometimes be misleading. All right, I got off track, but I just want to share my projects.
All right, fantastic. So, you know, and we're going to move into the more modern day wearing of corsets now, but let's, because people do still wear them, and they wear them often as a fashion statement. They wear them for a variety of reasons. Why did women abandon corsets? Why did women leave off wearing corsets? And what do you think? Why do you think they're back?
I mean, well, part of it, if you think about the changes in fashion in the early 20th century, well, I mean, there's a background to this with dress reform and all that, which really is starting, you know, around the time of the tight lacing. And I'm not going to go into the whole history of dress reform, but, you know, there are lots of proponents that were arguing for women's health. So it was, you know, part of it was a health thing, but then also just with women getting all kinds of new freedoms, whereas Nieves is in the audience. She's like our expert on this, her whole dissertation. But, you know, your life is totally changing. You are getting close to the vote. You are going out and smoking and drinking. You are maybe more active politically. Your whole life is becoming more free, and so the bodies are also becoming freer. And so I think that has something to do with it for women. So, and why are they back now? I mean, now I think it's almost a little bit more of a fetish. Well, what could be considered a fetish back then too, like the tight lacing I would call fetishism.
Yeah, the Ethel Granger case is often considered a sort of a fetish case.
Yeah.
I think a lot more people own corsets also than totally admit to it, you know, like
Today,
yeah. I think a lot of us have corsets and we're like, I don't know.
Well, and it depends if if you expand the thought into all the different types of undergarments that we wear today, like Spanx and things like that. There's plenty of shapewear today. It just sometimes looks a little bit different. So there's still things to shape and form your body and smooth it out, which I think is different than like if somebody today were to wear a corset that looked like this, you know, this blue satin one, which is almost, I mean, it's an object of beauty. You'd want to see that, I think, more than hiding it underneath.
Okay.
Well, and then the corset wasn't totally abandoned. Even into the 1920s, the flappers, they wore corsets that were very long down on the hips because you wanted that almost androgynous look. You wanted a tube up and down, but it still was not proper not to be bound in. You could wear those flowing, low-waisted dresses, but that body still needed to be controlled. And I'm glad you mentioned Spanx, because I was going to say that is today's corset, I guess. Have you ever tried to squeeze into Spanx? It is not easy. But I think now the corsets that Victoria's Secret sells and that, those may be worn under clothes out in the world, but mostly they're worn in the home. You know, they're worn sort of as a sexual thing between partners and that. I think with a lot of them, today's clothing is sheer and kind of, you know, filmy fabrics. You would see the cording and the bows and all that through your clothing. And I don't stare at people that often, but I don't know that I've seen too many of the stays and the little bows and things poking through people's clothing. But as women were entering the workforce, of course, they entered the workforce during World War II and then went back to the home in the 1950s and were back to doing their housework and that. We then were met with not quite the tight lacing of the corsets, but you still had girdles. I mean, then that's when the girdles showed up. And then we started to loosen up a little bit in the 60s. Then the late 60s and 70s, we were naked then, you know, so we were not trying to bind those bodies in too much. But I don't know that we'll ever go back to this type of corsetry again as a fashion statement, as an overall
where everybody is
statement.
wearing
Yeah,
a corset. Yeah.
It sounds to me like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like technology of the fabric played a role in that we now have the polymers and the elastics, and where for your wedding you wear Spanx, you don't wear something like that.
Right. Well, you do, but later. But yeah, you've got something that keeps the lumps and bumps in, and you know, it's glamorous underwear, but it definitely had a function at the time, and it was to keep women looking as though they were healthy, they were worthy of childbearing, and that's kind of when we get into the medical side of it. The corset is supposed to enhance that image of the healthy childbearing woman when actually it was doing the exact opposite. I mean, it was harming what it was supposed to be helping. So, but we'll, yeah.
Sorry, before we move on, I did bring a maternity corset.
Maternity corset. Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah. So there were maternity corsets advertised that did look like this, but they would have like extra lacing on the sides. This one is a little bit more forgiving. It's from about the turn of the century. But as you can see, this one's just cloth. There's no boning. And there's little places in the front that you can lace up and tighten. So as someone who is currently pregnant and doesn't want anything touching my belly, I can't imagine wearing a maternity corset. You know, the level of, but also I think that these are women that have been wearing a regular corset for most of their lives beforehand, so they were sort of used to it. But yeah, pregnancy is a whole other issue. Sometimes they would also have buttons on the breasts so they could breastfeed after as well.
Liz?
Yeah, so as promised, I'd just like to queer it up a little bit.
Go, Liz.
So, I don't know. You know, I don't know about the history of corsets. I find it fascinating, and there's so much to say. But as to like right now, whether they're back or not back, I mean, it's my understanding that corsetry is like an art form, and people use it in subcultures, and so it maybe like mainstream, it's not back. But actually, if you think about it, there are lots of like Madonna is the like, you know, with the cone breasts. Right. I mean, like
Did it ever go
so
away?
it's kind of
Yeah.
like Beyonce really has taken it back, and then most recently, interestingly enough, when Caitlyn Jenner came out on the cover of Vogue, Vanity Fair.
Vanity Fair, I think.
Vanity Fair, she was also wearing a corset, and there was some writing around the significance of her wearing a corset in her like coming out photo shoot. But you know, I want to take a step back real quick, just so we could just kind of expand some of our language around, you know, gender. That there's a difference between cross-dressers and like trans is an umbrella, and then cross-dressers and transvestite is a term that historians use, but like that's not really a term that people typically use within company. So that historian used it, but I would encourage us not to use that term unless someone were to use it for themselves. And then also, like, I think it would be interesting to think about the way that corsets and expression of femininity is used in people, lots of different genders of people, not just men and women, people who are non-binary or gender non-conforming, and that those identities exist too, and that the expression of femininity through corsetry is present within those communities, and and that also, you know, some trans women who do identify within the binary but identify as trans women use waist training to reshape their body to become more feminine in appearance. And then just people who are trans feminine or would like use that as a symbol, an ultimate symbol of femininity. And then there's also like queerness in femme culture, like queer and lesbian femme culture, and burlesque, where corsetry is used. And you know, also in like some like kink, BDSM, and other subcultures around sexuality, in which all these things kind of merge too. So I just thought I'd throw in a few of those, just a few thoughts as we move forward.
That actually pulls us right into a really good. The next question I had is sort of more for this side of the table, which is, you mentioned binding and sort of the symbolism of it, and I know there's binding, there's packing, there's a couple other things that are done, and I wonder, are there specific health risks, or is this more about expression?
It's primarily about expression. We want our people in our lives to live gender authentic lives and express their gender in whatever way they choose. There are a few health risks that we do caution our patients about. For example, our trans men who haven't had top surgery yet, and top refers to like top versus bottom. If you have breast tissue, but you want to present a male chest, a lot of our trans men will wear a binder, which is basically a corset that you buy usually on the internet. Think about wearing 4 sports bras at a time as sort of like the level of compression. Oh my God, couldn't even breathe. But that's one of the things. We do see some restrictive lung disease, which is where your lungs don't fully expand like they should, as you can imagine from that x-ray. And we also see a lot of soft tissue infections, for example, yeast infections under the breast tissue, just because there's no air circulation and there's no chance for that tissue to dry out, especially in the summer. So those are sort of a few of the medical implications for the binding that we see in the transgender community. And I can only imagine what the corseted people back in the day used to experience without air conditioning.
There was a lot of layers of cloth that was involved in there. You also mentioned, Liz, about fashion as a marker for gender identity, and I think that's a really interesting discussion to have. I tried tight lacing once just because I was curious. And it's a very interesting thing. Like, you feel entirely different. Like, you don't just look different, you feel entirely different while that's going on. And I thought it was cool for about 20 seconds, and then I breathed and went, but it is, I mean, people trained their waists a long time. It wasn't like you would just show up, I'm 30, and going, hey, somebody tight lace me. But it felt different. And so I think that clothing, fashion, like, right, it's not just, it's a marker of identity out there flagging other people, but it also changes the way you feel about your identity. Does anybody want to sort of expand on that or talk about that? We'll then open it up to bigger discussion.
I don't know if you noticed in the x-ray that you showed, but the internal organs are actually physically displaced from their normal place. So the stomach is usually right up under the rib cage, and in that picture, you couldn't even see the stomach. Who knows where it went? It was all shoved down. And so we think about the tissue and the tissues and the internal organs, we think about them as like hard plastic fixed models like in our science class dioramas, but in reality, they're squishy, soft, wiggly things that slide around relative to each other. So when all of your stomach stuff and guts and ovaries and what have you, and they're all shoved into such a tight place, they don't work like they should. There's reduced chance for normal peristalsis. I imagine there is a lot of bowel trouble, as well as heartburn, other things that happen when you wear pants that are too tight on Thanksgiving.
There's a really interesting book called Bound to Please. I love the cover. It's a very risque cover. It's by Lee Summers, and she's done a great, she's researched how much the corset actually impacted society, and through advertising in women's magazines, there truly was a demand for this, and found that a lot of the physicians who were seeing some of these women who couldn't breathe because their lungs were being pushed up, it's squeezed in the middle. The things that can go up, go up. The things that can go down, go down. And so you see a lot of upper lobe breathing, which is why, you have the heaving breast. That's what that's from. You do have the ribs that are squeezed in and creates a cone. And you can actually do that to yourself, which I tried once. I didn't try it with a corset. You just squeeze your ribs in with your hands, just squeeze in. It freaks you out. And because you feel all of a sudden these things move that you don't really think about moving. Your ribs, of course, are connected
We're all going to try
cartilage.
this now, right? Like,
Yeah,
just do
and
it.
you start to feel that moving in there. Well, one of the problems that physicians were seeing were prolapse uterus. They were blaming it, of course, on pregnancy and on hysteria and other problems that women had. And they said, if you just go home and get plenty of bed rest, start eating better, then you'll be fine. Well, these women went home, they took their corsets off, they got into bed, and poof, they feel better. Well, of course, it's not because they're in bed, it's because they took the corset off. And so things then can go back to where they belong. But I have something in here that I just found recently. It's in the exhibit. There was a woman who patented a corset that had a built-in pessary, which is the uterus supporter. So you put your corset on, you strap this thing between your legs, and you insert it into the vagina and hold the uterus up. Well, then what they didn't realize is that every time you move or try to sit down, that pessary is pushing up, and it's actually causing more damage didn't catch on too well, and is causing more damage. And they're finding also that the pessaries perforated the tissues. There were a lot of fistulas involved. And it's a fascinating book. It really is interesting.
So run out and get it right now.
You know, there were things that in my early research I didn't realize that, you know, I knew about prolapsed uterus, probably caused by a corset, but didn't realize that the apparatus that was supposed to be holding that womb up was actually causing as much damage as the corset was.
All right. Liz?
Just one comment before we move on, sorry. Not to deny any of the ramifications of wearing a corset, and I think many women did really damage their bodies, but there is also some argument within the fashion historian community about how many women really did tight lace and how tight was tight. And you know, there were some ladies' journals in the mid-19th century where letters were written about the horrors of tight lacing, which I should also mention was equated with like lower class I don't know, sleazy women, basically. Yeah. And some people question the validity of, those letters. Were they real? And there's not really any way for us today to know. So, yes, there are lots of horrors, but then some of it might have been sort of propaganda,
right,
too.
because some of it might have been used to also castigate lower class women. Because you basically look at lower class women and go, what can we say about them that I know? So, Liz?
I was just going to say, and hopefully we'll get to this, but so there's a lot of discussion around like the ramifications of the body and the way it was moved and so forth, all the organs. Although I'll note that when I was pregnant too, my organs moved all over the place. So, right, okay. But also I loved, I hope that we can move the conversation too to also talking about kind of what you were discussing a little bit earlier around the signifiers of identity and how corsets. Now I did a little research. I wish I knew more, but hopefully people in the audience you know about modern corsets and the ways in which they're used and safely, for instance. And so that, there's a lot of judgment one way or another around the use of corsetry. So I think it would be really cool to hear, because I know that there's feminist perspectives and genderqueer perspectives around the use of corsetry as expression and as liberation and so forth. So that would be cool too.
Yeah, in fact, we're now ready to actually open this up to the bigger group discussion. And I've set this up so we have a good 20 minutes because I'm really interested in hearing from you. And I know there's a couple people in the audience who sent me some materials actually recently about people who are waist training and learning how to waist train. Several other people have told me that they themselves have waist trained. And so I know there's a lot of you in the audience who have done different things. And I'm fascinated to hear what your take on this subject is. As I said, I tried tight lacing. It was tight. And somewhat uncomfortable. I then went out and bought one that was not like that at all. It was just sort of just kind of there, just sort of hanging out and making you feel pretty, but without the not breathing. I know people who also wear Spanx because they say, oh, I just like the feeling of everything being where it belongs. So there's sometimes something sort of weirdly comforting about this as well. And I think that we can open this to a larger discussion. So your questions, they can be for each other, they can be for our panelists, they can be for me. This is really supposed to be more like a dialogue than it is like a call and response. So I'm fascinated to hear what you have to say. I have to borrow one of the mics, and I will be the runner who goes to answer those questions. So questions, all right. I knew. Stand up, stand up. Oh yeah, it's on.
Okay, so I'm not an official anything except for a sex researcher, sort of. Not even grad school. But yes, my name is Zuleika. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, or she, her, hers. I do a lot of research in corsetry, obviously. And so, like, I want to tackle a lot of things here real fast. Okay, so those x-rays, are you aware of the doctor who took the x-rays?
There's several different time periods, several different doctors, and several different places where those were done.
Okay, so one of the most famous x-rays of, like, a corseted woman is, and there were a few of them up there, he took those x-rays on freshly corseted women, so, like, he laced them up with wire laces because those are x-rays. Fabric doesn't show up on x-rays. That's why you didn't see a stomach, because it's soft tissue. And all the corsets are positioned incorrectly. As you can see, your corset is supposed to rest exactly at your natural waist, which is on every body, is in a different place. So the poor man, God bless his heart, but didn't know what he was doing. 'Cause he's a dude, and, like, dudes didn't really corset. So, like, God bless you, but also. Second of all, when we talk about, like, this abandonment of the corset as if, like, we all left en masse away and, like, entered feminist utopia where we all live in a lesbian paradise. I wish. God, do I wish. But we hung on to girdles like the minute we dropped the corset.
Yeah,
we were like,
it's
now
true.
we got to do something else with our bodies.
It's true. It's true.
So, like, it's not as if we stopped fashioning the body. It's not as if we stopped wanting to make our bodies look a certain way. We just did it differently. And then we had, like, the 1970s fitness trend. So we stopped fashioning the body and we started sculpting the body. We started working out every day. We do yoga for 13 hours a week because that's what good white people do, right? So again, like, I want you to think about the body less as this, like, thing that must be controlled, but rather this element as part of fashion, as I like to call it. Like, fashion is done to the human body as a sartorial expression of a number of things. We do not get dressed every morning because, like, it's the natural thing to do. It's because, like, society expects us to show up clothed, and it expects us to show up clothed in a certain way, and that way it changes. So now that we have these, like, modern, mushy kind of cotton stretch things that, like, everyone in the audience is wearing some form of, including me, it kind of gives us this judgmental eye, but we are so unused to fashion that fits our body that anything will feel tight. So you mentioned that, oh, I tight laced once, but, like, of course it felt tight because up until this point there was so little on the modern body that actually fits the modern body that it immediately feels as if you're being constrained. Which, again, is something you have to think about. Like, if you think about the fact that if you grew up wearing a nice, tight something your entire life, to even loosen it a little bit is, like, an immediate expression of something. We don't, depending on what that is.
Women who drop the bra as soon as they get home,
Exactly. Like,
right? I was told there was bra burning in my parents' day, but I don't. They're still around. We didn't burn them all.
So with that all out of the way, so the thing I want to contribute to this discussion is, like, I am, like, the gay and also very trans. And you were talking about somebody who identified, as their own narrative said, I was always a woman, and you have read me incorrectly, which reminds me a lot of the way Christine Jorgensen framed modern trans femininity, which was, I have always been a woman, and then medical science showed up and saved me from nature, which, you know, is one way of looking at it. But Christine Jorgensen did the same thing. She would put on these, like, huge 1950s style flowing, because those were in fashion in 1955, but also because it made her look like society expected women to look. And if you live in an era where there is no other option, I think that is something you have to read back into history. You can't read the T word back into history, both trans and trans, because that concept didn't exist. There was no idea of trans people until pretty recently. Like, I would say the early 20s is, like, the first time we get this idea. We get the first gender confirmation surgeries, but, like, there's a reason Christine Jorgensen is famous in the 50s, because, like, she did a lot of stuff that kind of still sticks with us. And there's just, like, a lot of fashion history needs us to take our modern assumptions and really contextualize them in entirely different ways.
That's actually a really good point for medical history too. One of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about at the Dittrick Museum and in our other events is that we have a tendency to always try to look backwards in time with the same eye. So we look backwards at pre-antiseptic medicine and think, my God, they were barbarians. But they weren't. They were doing the best they could for what the resources that were available. And so again, thank you very much. I partly appreciate and find interesting this use of really in a lot of the texts. Like, we have to really find out what this person really was. And maybe that's something that's less important. That text, by the way, that used transvestite is 15 years old. So again, things have really changed. Sorry, now I just used it. Things have changed quite a bit. So other questions, comments, responses? Okay, I saw back in you first, and then I will come forward and get you second.
Hi, I'm Faye. I'm from the local Cleveland Zeppelin Union, steampunk fashion enthusiasts.
Just giving myself away a little bit there.
So, for the past few years, when I do steampunk events, I wear corsetry. I wish I'd worn one today, but I thought I'd kind of share a little bit what it's like. I also do the Victorian fashion, so my gowns are meant to fit over a corset, and they don't fit right without the corset. In fact, I have 2 sets of measurements in my costuming book, one for with a corset and one without, because they're different. As you can see, I'm kind of a large person, so I don't tight lace, and I don't really have a lot of that feeling of, feeling really constricted. But what I do have is a lot of reshaping potential. So, it really sort of, I've worn Spanx before in an attempt to get like a smooth, clean line. And the corset really goes a step beyond. Like for me, Spanx are only going to do so much before they start outlining bulges, whereas the corset will force it into that nice hourglass shape. And, to a certain extent, it feels like I really now have a body that is more desirable and more, appropriate to femininity, in that I have an hourglass shape, in that, I have kind of pendulous breasts and they come up and are more prominent. And so, it looks actually a lot better than my everyday kind of wear ends up looking. And as someone who is sort of, gender queer, it's kind of, it's a step in the feminine direction in days where, as you can see, I went to work today, so I'm wearing more masculine clothing. Which I generally tend to do in my day-to-day because I work in a very male-dominated field, and it helps me feel more masculine and more able to compete. So, it helps kind of move those boundary markers.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. All right, and then I saw you next.
Okay. My question is, how did they feel about hermaphrodites? Did they ask the parents? I know they used to ask the parents if they wanted a boy or a girl, but back then,
that's a good question.
how did they dress them?
Anybody want to take that one up?
Well, first we don't use that term.
Wait.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'll see what I'll
Yeah.
think.
So
while she's talking.
that term is and some people don't know this. That term is really, it's outdated and sometimes a little offensive. But we now use the term intersex.
Intersex. Okay.
Yeah,
So instead
yeah.
of that, it's
yeah,
intersex.
and
Okay.
it's just if you're not aware of it, you're not aware of it. But that's what the I stands for, the LGBTQI. And I'm sorry, I got distracted by the H word. But what is that? What was the question again?
What did the in history?
How would they essentially dress them?
Oh, there's like a whole history of total, like, absolute medical oppression around intersex people that is it's pretty drastic. And intersex people, I mean, were before and still to a certain extent now, a baby was born, and if they were on the exterior, they were unable to determine what their biological sex was, even though that term is problematic, from their genitalia. Then oftentimes the doctors would say to the parents, your baby's born with a deformity, we have to fix it. And then they'd choose a gender for the baby based on what they thought would be easier surgically to create. And then that person was forced to grow up, right? And so children who are intersex were put into binary, one or the other. And there's whole intersex communities that have been doing advocacy around intersex rights by saying, like, this is essentially mutilation of my body, and I was not allowed to actually grow up to know my own gender. internally, because you chose my gender for me before I was even allowed to know it. So they were oftentimes the question as to how they would dress them. They would dress them according to whatever gender they decided the baby was. And then it was up to that that child, that person to grow. There's a great Intersex Society of North America is a good resource if you're interested in learning more.
And in the case that I mentioned that took place in the 18th century, they surgically turned what they thought was a little girl into a little boy. So they sometimes surgically did that. But to be honest with you, if you could look way back, if you're looking at before surgery was safe enough to do for things like that, they would often just label them as monsters. So for instance, Ambrose Paré' book talks about that.
Case of Stella Walsh. I don't know if you've heard of Stella. Was a track runner and won a gold medal in the 1950s, I believe. Lived her life as a woman. Upon her death, and I don't remember what she died of, they did an autopsy and found male genitalia that had not descended, and they determined that she was a fraud and took her gold medal away posthumously.
It's terrible. Yeah.
And that wasn't all that long ago. I mean, really.
There's a great
history.
book by Helen King about gender, looking back at ancient Greeks and Roman times and how they perceived intersex, and it's really fascinating. So it's Helen King has a book on that. I forget the title at the moment, but it says a lot about how they tried to get their heads around what intersex was or what they thought. They typically thought that a woman was a failed man. So like they thought that, I know, them, not me, that they thought that women were cold and men were hot. And so the proper heat of the body pushed the genitals out. And so that made a man's penis. Well, I'm just telling you. And then if you were too cold, that they would all suck up inside and you would stay female. And so whenever so they had, in cases of intersex, they tended to think there was some sort of temperature problem in the womb. So I'm sorry I went down that rabbit hole, but questions? Sorry.
Yeah.
Stand up.
Just a comment and maybe a question that might be interesting to think about is that in the 19th century, corset was not worn on the skin. I mean, there was 2 or 3 or even 4 layers before a corset was put on the body. So like now we wear bras and things that our undergarments are skin to on the skin. So it's also like tight lacing. It's like it's after like 4 layers of linen, it's not that tight. So we need to kind of like put that into factor. But I think the more interesting maybe question is, and I think it's one of your comment that says that when trans men wants to look more feminine, they wear a corset. So it somehow the corset become kind of like much identified with femininity. And even you kind of like mentioned, when I want to look feminine, I put on a corset because the hourglass is kind of like the epitome of femininity. And kind of like it's maybe interesting to ask, how come the corset became such a symbol of femininity? Because, men wear corsets too. And, so why is that?
Yeah. And they did in the 19th century.
And they did, and certainly they did in the 19th century. So why is the corset kind of like became the symbol of femininity?
Great question. Yeah. Group? Ideas? You're like, no.
I think it was that whole image of childbearing. Men don't bear children, women do. Women are feminine, and this contrivance is going to make sure that every woman looks as though they are worthy of childbearing. They're healthy, and I don't know exactly why. I mean, I don't imagine that a man would need to, and this would not be a trans man, or this would be a cis male, would need to wear a corset. What shape are we trying to get out of a male body wearing a corset? I mean, of course, we like the triangle shape in a man. Who doesn't? Broad shoulders, kind of a narrow waist. But most men, I think, are obtaining that look through exercise.
That's the
and even
sculpting,
in the
yeah.
19th century, we had We had health gurus. What's the name of the gentleman? Jim McFadden was the name of the gentleman who was like the Jack LaLanne of the turn of the century. And he was all about weightlifting and obtaining that perfect male figure. So I'm not sure what a corset, maybe a corset would do that too. I don't know.
But there were male corsets that, there were a number of male corsets that did exactly that and shaped the body into a V shape 100 years ago.
Not
But
bringing out
for-
the hips.
Yeah, so not the corset,
No,
not the
no,
hourglass.
just
yeah.
the
it would be
cone
the similar kind of thing, but it would accentuate the gender, and if it was identity based, then it would be identity based. So you could do the same thing now, just as a biological marker. It's the shape goes with the gender.
Just a note on language.
Wait.
Yeah. So when we're talking about people who assigned male at birth who identify as women, that they're called trans women, not the other way around. And I think we've been kind of just so we're on the same page. So trans women, right? Okay.
All right.
Thank you. I just want to add one mini thought to that. I mean, if you think about historically, if you're looking at the history of fashion, one way to look at it is looking at the silhouette, and it's always looking at the woman. And while male silhouettes did change, women's bodies really were the subject of manipulation in many ways, from bustles to corsets to changing the shape. And so I don't know. I think I wonder if there's some connection there. I'm not able to articulate it right now, but yeah, at least historically, maybe not, today.
It's really interesting. You got lots of hands. One of the things that studying the 18th century will tell you is that men's fashions were very important in the 18th century, and they grew sort of less elaborate as time went on. And so in the 18th century, you had men wearing hose and heels to make them taller, and in medieval times, there was this long pointy shoe fetish thing that was for a while, and there was a lot of that. Big square stuff, cod pieces, come on. Yeah. Seriously. But in the 19th century, it got it hasn't varied that much. Like if you look at a 19th century tuxedo and a tuxedo today, you would wonder whose wedding you were at. So, yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to make a comment about why we are focusing on women in history and how the silhouette of women have changed. And the thought occurred to me that there's a lot of sexualization of women, and whether that's you are expressing it or it's being put on you. I think whether it's oppression or freedom is your choice. So if you're choosing to wear the corset because it makes you feel good, then that's freedom. But if you're doing it because that's what is expected of women at the time and you want to match the silhouette, then that can be that repression of it. But
So sometimes the same thing can be two different things, can mean two different things for different people. I got a person back here and a person here. Oh my goodness, that's hilarious. Okay.
Dandy from 1819.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
This is the male dandy in the early 19th century, and he is being tight-laced, and additionally he has padding on his shoulders and hips. So
I can take this around. Do you guys want? Could you mind if I share?
Oh yeah,
okay,
sure.
I'll share it around.
I mean, again, it's a caricature, of course. It's not a
right.
It's a different type of historical document, but
it's certainly very telling.
And one thing I've thought about in museums is I've never come across a museum collection where we're like, we have a male corset, which I'm sure that's a whole nother discussion about why don't we
collect those kinds of objects?
Were men ashamed to be like, here, museum, here's my beautiful corset that I wore? Was it more of a secret for men than women, or is it just that they didn't save them, or
they wore them out? No,
right?
All right.
Yeah.
Question right here.
I was kind of following the tack of this earlier comment. I have read, I think it was Naomi Wolf, The Beauty Myth, talking about how women's fashion, and I guess trying to use that in the most gender inclusive way that I could, kind of follows the political climate, in that in periods of conservatism, like the Reagan eras and whatever, people would women's fashion and even women's bodies to the point of exercising more and dieting more strictly there's more, fashion requires more work from women, and kind of tracing that in trying to keep them economically oppressed.
Okay, interesting.
So like women's liberation kind of not cause and effect, but I guess more causally related to our political climate. And I was actually just like, Spanx, Trump, what's really up? Yeah, but now we have Spanx and Trump.
Now we have Spanx and Trump. That's
So
like
we all
the
gotta-
comment for the evening. Now we have Spanx and Trump. I want to. This is related to what you're saying. And sorry, I have one person up here. Wait, there you go. I'm gonna pass that. Just related to that comment, and I think also sort of joining some of this together about race and culture. I'm sorry, about economic and culture, though race is involved too. Again, I studied the 18th century. I told you, men's fashion's amazing in the 18th century. Women's fashion's amazing. If you were of a certain class. And what it really was a leisure class. They were a class of people who they weren't out there milking cows in this stuff. They were a leisure class, and that leisure class were the only ones really who dressed in this way. They were the only ones who had, the silk hose and all of the wigs, the big wigs and all that. That wasn't the average standard person. There wasn't really a middle class until close to the end of the 18th century. And it's not really until you get at the end of the 18th century, you have the consumer class is starting to rise, the merchant class, they're buying things. You have the industrialization comes along in the 19th century, and so suddenly you've changed what those fashion markers mean. And I love, if you've never read the book Evelina by Fanny Burney, there's a whole scene where an aristocratic person is complaining about all of these middle-class people dressing like aristocratic people. She's like, I can't tell them apart. So it's really an interesting comment on the way economics is involved. And so I think that you had, I think you're onto something there. So
I wanted to bring it back to the how a corset or what you said earlier about Spanx holding things in and into place. We actually went to a steampunk convention with my sister-in-law, and she put on a corset for her very first time, and she has high anxiety, and she found it was like a human thunder shirt, like what you would put on your dog. Yeah. And so from that point on, she had been a regular consumer of corsets just to keep the anxiety at bay. Personally, I like a corset only to hold my wallet and my phone without needing pockets, because women's clothing, pockets are a symbol of power, and so women's clothing doesn't tend to have it. And so I wear my corset light enough so I can carry those two things and still breathe and eat. So,
all right, thank you. That's fantastic. All right, did you want to say something?
Creative way to do that. The thunder shirt thing that you're talking about for dogs, a lot of kids on the autism spectrum also enjoy the compression, and occupational therapists provide that with elastic garments, but it's really cool that you found a way to do it with the corset. So, good fashion.
Yeah,
very clever.
That's cool. Sorry. There's so many hands. I don't remember who's had their hands up first and where you all are.
So I wanted to bring it back around a little bit to the geek community again, with the Zeppelin Union being here. One interesting thing that's different now than maybe say 25 years ago is that geek and nerd culture was. So you would have your steampunk, and you would have your Star Trek, and you would
Gothic.
have your horror, and you would have your fetish communities. And a lot of those overlap a lot. So you could go to a fetish ball and meet some of your same friends who you might also go to a Star Trek convention to later, or a steampunk, get together another time. Now, what's different now between, say, maybe 25 years ago is this has now exploded into the mainstream. So you used to have people who could cosplay and feel very comfortable regardless of their body type or their gender identity, and not feel judged because the communities were so tight. Now you go to conventions and everyone's doing it, and it's a beauty contest, and there's a lot of arguing going back and forth about, people who maybe go and are inappropriate to people who are in costume when they're not used to that sort of thing, and judging, or beauty queens coming in and taking over, and people making fun of the people who were doing it for the last 25 years. So the costuming and the corsetry is also a part of that, that community.
I want to see if you guys want to comment on that, because I think that this gets back to our question about fashioning identity. It's actually something that you brought up, our very first questioner brought up, which is that, is this actually something that is positive? Is this our ability to fashion our identity the way we want? Or is it something that somehow constantly recreates systems of oppression as it gets bigger or as it becomes mainstream? And that's something that I see in the news all the time, questions about mainstreaming and what is that normalization, norming, what does that mean? And I'm curious, especially in terms of the LGBT community, the trans community, what does that mean for people? Is this universally accepted as a good thing? Is it not a good thing? How should we feel about it?
I don't know. I think that I try not to. I think that everything's contextual, so that there is a space. It depends on how people are utilizing and how they're feeling about it. Like I'm always about like consent with one's own body and like the ability to freely express one's gender in multiple ways. And so like I think that queer community has done a lovely job in like helping to do that. Like there are so many ways in which the queer and trans community, can make space, I should say, for gender expression in a million different ways. And I think so I don't know if it has to be either or, and I think it just really depends on the context in which a person is doing this. And yes, can it be repressive? Absolutely. Was it repressive for that woman? We don't know. We don't know her circumstances. And people do wear corsets for different reasons. It could be physical feelings, like we talked about. I mean, it's just so it's all so based in history and then also like the current context, I guess. That was really like a total word jumble. Sorry.
There's a lot of good
There's a lot
keywords
going on
there,
in my
though.
head. All right, thank you. I'll turn it over though.
I think
No, it's great.
Just like a lot of the things that we do to our bodies as one tool to express who we are. And as long as, if there's a medical risk or something, and if you know about it and you do what you can to minimize the danger, and honestly, the dangers can be minimized, and it's just a way for people to be who they are. So I think that in general, I try not to put labels of good or bad on things, but I don't know, if people are being themselves, I guess that's good.
Okay. We're going to kind of wrap up because I want to make sure there's 15 minutes for you to talk amongst yourselves, for you to visit the display, for you to get heart-shaped cookies, because love, right? Speaking of heart-shaped cookies, is it wrong that I'm thinking, you mean if I got a corset I wouldn't have to exercise? Because it just sounds like a lot less work in some ways. So, right, yeah. Okay, so thank you all for being here. You have been part of a conversation. I hope you will come back and join us with other conversations in the future. Thank you so much for your thoughts. I'd like to thank our panel as well. So a round of applause.